Let's take a look at using isolated storage. This is a bit like using cookie storage. It's isolated per user and then either per application or per site, i.e. per domain. And what you get is an ability to store little pieces of data into a private area of the file system that's isolated, as we say, and read that back, so you get to store persistent things on the user's machine. Now this is quota controlled. We'll look at how you expand isolated storage, or at least ask to expand isolated storage, in a subsequent video. Here we're just going to use isolated storage. So I've already got a Silverlight application here, Silverlight project and a testing web project, and I've started to build a little bit of code in my Silverlight project. Basically what I've done is I've built this UI, and on this UI what we've got fundamentally is a canvas and we've got a button, and I've abstracted away some implementation details of this program. So let's just press F5 and see what it does right now, so you get an idea. What the program allows me to do, and this is obviously completely arbitrary, let's ignore the breakpoints for a second, is it allows me just to draw rectangles on the screen. The idea being that maybe for some reason I want to store these so that when I return to the site I have my rectangles already displayed on the screen. So it's just the idea of wanting to store some state about my visit to this site on my machine rather than storing them up at the website. So I draw a rectangle, ignore the breakpoints for a second, we draw another one, ignore the breakpoints for a second, and the idea is that if I refresh this application now, you'll see that as we use the application, let's refresh, the first thing that happens is it calls this load rectangles function looking for a list of persisted rectangles, which we don't yet have. So let's just press F5 and we've lost our previous state. Anytime I draw a rectangle, we can see that we call this function asking to save the rectangles, and at the moment we don't do anything, so we aren't building up that persistent state, we're losing it. We can see now we've got two rectangles. And then finally, if you press this delete button at the bottom, what it does is it calls this delete rectangles function, which again at the moment doesn't do anything, and so consequently nothing ends up on the screen. Okay, so let's pop back to Visual Studio, stop debugging, and our job then basically is to save these rectangles on behalf of this application. We're going to use isolated storage for this, and you might be surprised how easy this proves to be, although I'll show you a couple of ways of working, one of which will be very easy and one will be slightly more difficult but give you a little bit more control. Okay, so first off, let's bring in a namespace using system.io.isolated-storage. Let's let that expand and collapse. Now within there are classes like isolated storage file, file stream, and settings. We're going to start with settings. Hanging off there we can see two properties. One of these is isolated per user per application. One of these is isolated per user per site. So what this means is that if you go with application settings, your storage will only be available to your application. If you go with site settings, your storage will be available to your application and other applications that come from the same site. So it's a question of how you want to isolate your storage. Other than that, these things kind of work the same way. So what we're going to do is I'll use application settings, and we provide a key like my rectangles, something like that, and we set it to a value like the rectangle list that we get given. And as long as this thing can be serialized, we'll store that for you in isolated storage. When we come to load these things back, we need to say, let's say list of rectangles list equals null. Let's say return that list at the end of the function, and let's say if isolated storage settings.application settings contains the key my rectangles, then what we'd want to do is say list equals isolated storage settings dot application settings my rectangles as a list of rectangle. Otherwise we leave it as null. Let's go build. Let's press F5. So we see the application load up again. It comes to see if there are any persisted rectangles. There shouldn't be. We draw a rectangle. It should be saving that. Let's just check that code's running over. We draw another rectangle, it should be saving both of those. Let's just check that that code's running over. And if we now refresh the browser altogether with an F5, we see it loading rectangles, press F5, they're back on the screen. So this is very, very simple. You know, I mean, it couldn't be much simpler than that, really. If we go and implement our delete button behind this, what we could do in delete rectangles here is we could go ahead and say, well, we should really check, but we'll just say that isolated storage.application settings dot remove my rectangles, And if we go and press F5 now, hoping that no one presses delete at the wrong time, we can see that we've currently got two, oh excuse me, let's just clear the breakpoints and run on. Two rectangles stored. If we delete those, we should see us calling that code to delete. And if we now refresh the browser, load again, our rectangles have gone. Okay, so as I said, this is the simple way of doing this. There is a more complicated way that gives you more sort of flexibility. Let's just go back to where we were previously and get rid of some of these functions. So rather than using those settings classes, what we can use is a class called isolated storage file, and we can ask it to give us a store either for the application or for the site. So that's per user per application or per user per site. So that's your choice as to whether you want to go that way or not. So we'll go for user for application, and then what we can ask us to do is give us things like directories and files within here. So we have a sort of mini file system that we can play with. We'll come back and look in a subsequent video at quotas and increase quota. But essentially you get this idea of being able to have a mini file system scoped per user per application. So let's try and use this. Let's go ahead and we'll say isolated storage file equals isolated storage file dot get user store for application. And then we can walk up to this and we can say that what we want this to do is to create as a file, which will give us a file stream. So we can say using isolated storage file streams, let's call this file stream, equals file.create file, and we'll give it a path that we'll call rect.xml, something like that. Okay, and at the end of this I guess we should say filestream.close. Now what we now need to do is write something into that. So what I'll do is I'll bring in a reference to link to XML, so that's system.xml.link. I'll bring in namespace for system.link. We'll sort out the one for system.xml.link in a second. And what we'll do is we'll use a class called xElement, which comes from that API. Let's bring in the namespace for it. Let's allow this to expand and collapse. And we'll go ahead and say data equals new xElement. We'll call my XML rectangles as the root. And then we'll say from R as a rectangle, in the list of rectangles we've been given, we'll select a new X element, which we'll call rectangle. And we'll just set some attributes on it. We'll have one for top, which will be r.top. We'll have another one for left, which will be r.left. We'll have another one for width, which will be r.width. We'll have another one for height, which will be r.height. And we should have created some XML. What we then want to do is save that into the file stream we've been given. So we'll create an XML writer. So we'll say using XML writer, writer equals XML writer.create on top of that file stream. And then we'll go ahead and say data.save into that writer. And then we'll say filestream.close. I suppose we should really say writer.close as well there as well. So hopefully we're now saving all that stuff into a file. Notice this is a lot more work than we were doing before. We're using XML, we don't have to use XML. But if we got the code right, we're now taking some more control and we're working with a file ourselves. Let's build this and let's just see if we can single step this code and make it work before we progress. So let's just go and draw a rectangle on the screen. Let's ignore the call to load, which doesn't do anything right now. Draw a rectangle. Let's see if we're creating that file, creating some XML, saving it, closing it, closing it. Looks kind of good. So let's stop debugging and let's go and look at load rectangles. What we'll do here is we'll kind of duplicate the code to some extent. So we'll go and copy this code and use it as a template for this code that we've got down here. So let's go ahead and get the user store for the application. Instead of using create file though, we need to say .open file, and that is going to be rect.xml, and the file mode is going to be just open. We should probably check that we haven't got an exception there because it might not exist. So let's clear this code for a second because we don't need it right now. And let's wrap a try and a catch around that because it doesn't matter to me if we actually fail in doing this. So we'll do that. Let's go ahead and create an XML reader. So let's say using XML reader, reader equals XML reader.create. And we want to put that on top of the file stream that we've got. And then what we need to do is say xElement data equals, and we'll say xElement.load from that XML reader. So now we've got the data. What we want to do is turn that back into a list of rects. So we'll say list equals, and we'll say from R in data.descendants and self that are called rectangle. What we want to do is select a new rect, and on that rectangle we want to set the x to be equal to, go and get back the value of the attribute on the rectangle called left. Let's copy this a few times just to shorten the typing a little bit. We want to set y to be top, we want to set width to be the width, we want to set height to be, the height, and that should be kind of okay. It looks like we've got a problem building. Okay, we haven't converted this into a list, so what we need to do is just take that and take the whole thing and say .toList on it. So we should be able to build, that should give us a list of rectangles. Okay, so let's try running the application again. Let's see if we manage to get this right at all. So coming into load rectangles, we look for the file, we try and open that file, we don't find it there in the first instance. Let's move along. Let's draw some rectangles in here, so we should be saving a rectangle now. Let's draw another one with saving rectangles again. Let's refresh the application, which brings us back into load. Hopefully we do now find that file. It looks like I typed it wrong, so we're not going to find the file. rect.xml, let's press F5, see if that load function gets better this time. So we drop into our load function, here we are finding the file, reader, we try and find those elements, we close the stream, press F5, and we're loading our rectangles back from that file. So, this is a lot more work than we had before, but it's giving us the full access to the isolated storage area. We can create folders in there, we can create files in there, subject to the quotas, which we'll explore in another video. Just to complete our functionality like we had it before, we can use isolated storage file .getUserStore for application .delete file with rects.xml in order to delete that file when somebody deletes their rectangles, and we can build that. So hopefully you get an idea as to how this works. It's partition per user and then per application or per site. We can use the simple settings API, or we can use the isolated storage file API if we need more control, as you've seen here. It's really up to you. Obviously you don't have to use XML in any of that if you don't want to. I just used it here as a convenience for me. But you get this idea of being able to store things on the machine in a quoted, secure manner. We'll take a look at how you deal with those quotas in a follow-on video.